Northway here with another Chinese fantasy novel FAQ, and today I am talking about a subject that was voted on by the patrons on my Patreon. If you like the content that I produce, you can consider subscribing on Patreon. The link is in the description below. You can also support direct via PayPal, or you can just like and subscribe and share the video too. That's much appreciated. Anyway, the patrons on Patreon voted for this topic actually twice in a row. Last time it was a tie, this time it won out, so I am talking about it. Now, this topic actually originally comes from another video I did. So I'm gonna reveal the top 10 most hated cliches, tropes in Chinese fantasy novels. If you haven't watched that, you can watch it here. And spoilers about that video, the number one topic is what I'm talking about today, which is when the main character of one of these fantasy series is being attacked by somebody who wants to kill them. Then that main character fights back. That person and the people they're with are super angry and offended that the main character would defend himself. And so I see, well, not only was that voted as the number one most disliked cliche or trope, but in the comments sections of the novels and on the discussion forums and whatnot, I see people complaining about this all the time. And like, my mental image is of the readers on their phone or at their computer, and when they see this situation developing, like, I envision all the readers like going, oh, and some of them, their heads just explode from frustration. I don't know, that's just my perception. But the point is, people really don't like it, and I feel that to some extent, some of that is because of a lack of understanding or familiarity with Chinese culture. That's just my personal opinion. I'm gonna get into some details about that in a moment. I'm not saying that I disagree. I also agree that that kind of situation in these novels is annoying and comes up way too often. However, I don't find those scenarios to be rage-inducing personally. And let me get into some of the details about that. So I think some of this does come down to a fundamental difference between Chinese culture and specifically Western culture, but also other cultures besides just the Western world, cultures that are not Chinese. There are a lot of cultures that are not Western culture per se that are very similar to Chinese culture. So again, I'm not saying that it's like a black and white thing, but there is a big difference. One thing that I see people say a lot, at least in the English-speaking world, is that all people are the same. Deep down inside, we're all just people. Well, okay, technically that's true, but it is completely incorrect to assume that just because we're all people, that we all think the same way. People think differently, people behave differently, people have different belief systems, and the Chinese way of thinking, Chinese belief system, is very, very different. I can tell you, after having lived there 8 years, that there are ways that Chinese people think that are just very different from the way that we think in, let's just say, the English-speaking world. Because I personally feel that the language is tied up to it a lot as well. I don't want to get too much into the weeds here, but there is a difference between high context and low context cultures, and Chinese is a high context culture. Western culture, let's just say specifically American culture, is not, and that affects the language as well. If you don't know what I'm talking about in terms of high context, low context, you can Google it. Basically, Chinese culture is dependent a lot on the context of what is being said and done, whereas low context culture tends to be, I think you could say, it's more precise. So in Chinese, I'll give you a classic example. I'm really starting to wander here. But a classic example is with boyfriend and girlfriend situations. Chinese girlfriend will ask Chinese boyfriend,
do you feel like having a popsicle?
And what that really means is, I want you to get me a popsicle. As opposed to perhaps in, let's say, American culture, a girlfriend might say to a boyfriend,
wow, I really want a popsicle. Can you give me a popsicle?
So that's just kind of one example to show the difference between the two. In Chinese, the context matters. So going back to where I was a moment before, the point is just that Chinese and Western English speaking is very different. One of the differences has to do with, I guess you could call it collectivism to some extent. In the Western world, whether you're talking about going back all the way to like Romans, Greeks, getting into Christianity, Judaism, whatever point you want to start at and kind of trace the roots forward and backward, the point is, I think that in Western culture, there's a much greater emphasis on the individual and their ability and right to make decisions and to be a person. Whereas Chinese tradition, going way back to, let's say, basically Confucianism, and again, I'm talking in really big generalities here, but basically Confucianism is about one's role within the structure of family and society and culture. Within Confucianism, you have your place and you're supposed to stay in that place and support the people above you, follow the orders, do what you're told, that kind of thing. And that mentality has been a part of the Chinese way of thinking for a really, really, really long time. Obviously, there were different takes on Confucianism. There were times when it was more important, less important. You also have to throw in the major religions that affected Chinese thought for many centuries and millennia, Buddhism and Taoism. And of course, there are homegrown religions and there were outside influences. It's a big complicated thing. But in the end, I think that the main way of Chinese thinking is that you're supposed to follow orders and you're supposed to stay within your place in society. And so when you are in a situation where a social superior tells you to do something, you should do it. That includes if, like, for example, let's say the general comes into town. I'm talking about like a big army. And he says, you commoners, you're all guilty of a crime, get over here to be executed. They would be expected to go over there to be executed. They wouldn't be expected to be like, no, we refuse, and then grab swords and start fighting. Now, I'm just talking generally speaking, okay? Obviously, there's gonna be people who fight back, and obviously there's gonna be heroes that rise up. But the prevailing attitude, I think, among superiors is that those who are inferior should follow orders and not be defiant. So in these situations where you have a person coming along that attacks or tries to kill the main character, inherently that person is going to view themselves as being probably socially superior and most likely superior in terms of strength, importance, position, wealth, whatever it is. And so when they come and they're like, I'm gonna kill you, they are expecting that person to say, okay, and then just drop down to be killed. Yeah, that's how they should react. If I am your superior, I'm stronger than you, I'm more important than you, and I tell you, hey, you are gonna be executed, then they should just wait to be executed. So I feel like, I'm not saying it makes it like make sense more or makes it less frustrating, but I personally feel like it makes more sense in the context of the culture. Now, don't get me wrong, I understand that in Western culture there's similar things. When the king tells you that you're guilty of a crime, you should go along and be punished for whatever crime you committed. And the similar stuff does happen in Western culture and whatnot, but it's more exaggerated on the Chinese side. I think there's a lot of things in Chinese culture that are basically similar to the West, but more exaggerated. I talk about this in my video about face that I just recently did, where the concept of face exists in Western culture as well. I see this whenever I talk about face in videos. People make comments like, well, that basically just means reputation, like in English. Yeah, I get it. That is basically what it means. But the entire concept is baked into the culture and is way more important, way more codified than it is in the West. So this was kind of just like a real ranting, long video about the subject. I hope it provided at least a little bit of context. What are your thoughts on the matter? Are there any egregious situations that you've seen in novels that you'll never forget? Have you noticed anything within the novels that you think counters my argument or proves me wrong? Feel free to leave those in the comments. I think that at this point in the novel translation scene, there are a lot of you readers who have actually read way more Chinese fantasy novel fiction than I have. I've obviously read a lot because whenever I translate, I have to read ahead, then I read while I'm translating, then I'm reading while I edit, and then I obviously go back and read other times as well. But in terms of the variety of content, I think there are many of you out there who have actually read a lot more than me. So although I do have probably a big advantage in terms of the cultural side and the language side, in terms of the sheer quantity of stuff that I have encountered, there are probably many of you out there who surpass me. So I'm definitely curious about your opinions. And that's it for this video. So again, if you like the content, please do like and subscribe, share, leave comments. I really appreciate it. And I'll see you in the next video. 告辞了。